It is 2 a.m. and the city has gone dark. Every window is black. Every traffic light is dead. You walk down the main street with a flashlight, counting every person you meet. A security guard half asleep in a lobby. A taxi driver leaning against his car. And then nobody else. By the central square, the beam finds one set of footprints. Yours. The camera pulls back, and the street is empty around you. How many people would you need to find before humanity could start again? That question sounds like a riddle you could answer with a boat, a couple, and a quiet evening. It is not. A species that is too small collapses under its own genes. A species that is too scattered can fall to one disease. A small, tired group of strangers cannot feed, pair, or carry forward a species that is too big. Life has a minimum order, and genetics has spent decades trying to count it. By the end of this video, you will never look at a crowded street the same way again. That is a promise. The answer hides in a spreadsheet of endangered species, a Wyoming ferret rescue, a typhoon on a Pacific island, and a moment about 930,000 years ago when our ancestors nearly ran out of people. Come with me, and you will end up somewhere far stranger than a survival guide. Let me show you the trap first. The standard answer sounds romantic. 2 people, a boat, a small family that somehow contains all the knowledge of civilization. Who should go on the list? A doctor, a farmer, a teacher, a builder. 50 people seems like plenty. 100 sounds luxurious. But genetics does not see those small groups as a rescue. It sees them as a malfunction. What does too small actually do to a body? Every human carries a few recessive mutations that would be harmful if you inherited 2 copies, one from each side. In a large population, those mutations rarely meet. Most people are not related enough to share the same bad copy. In a founding group, everyone shares a recent ancestry, so the same hidden defect keeps coming up. The cost appears as miscarriage, infant death, immune weakness, and fertility problems. In 2006, Julian O'Grady and his co-authors modeled realistic levels of inbreeding depression into wild population projections. They found that it sharply increased extinction risk. This is not a footnote. It is one of the main ways small populations die. Imagine you are in charge of that small crew. You have 30 people, enough food for the year, and everyone loves each other. You also have a gene pool the size of a postage stamp. Every child is a lottery ticket drawn from the same tiny bag. Some of those tickets carry recessive illnesses that show up only when 2 relatives share the same bad copy. A population that small does not simply get unlucky. It gets unlucky with compound interest. Back in 1980, evolutionary geneticist Ian Franklin put a famous number on the wall, around 50. The idea was that below that scale, inbreeding would start dragging down fertility and survival. Above it, drift would still eat away the variation a species needs for the long run. 50 was never a restoration plan. It was a fire alarm. It said that a group has entered the red zone. 30 years later, the alarm got louder. Richard Frankham, Corey Bradshaw, and Barry Brook reviewed the evidence in 2014. They concluded that an effective population of 50 is not enough even for 5 generations. You need roughly 100 breeders to keep inbreeding depression from cutting total fitness too hard. For long-term evolutionary potential, they pushed the target to roughly 1,000. Why push so high? Because drift is quiet. It does not kill everyone at once. It just drains the pool 1 generation at a time. Here is where counting gets traitorous. Scientists do not count a population the way you count attendance at a wedding. They count effective population size, which measures how many individuals actually contribute genes to the next generation. In many real species, that effective number is only about 10 to 20% of the head count. Old people, sick adults, dominant males, isolated subgroups, and uneven sex ratios all shrink the pool of real breeders. A town of 5,000 might have an effective size close to 500 or 1,000. What does that mean for safety? It means the census number is a rumor. The effective number is the biological reality. Now bring in the meta-analysis. In 2007, Loughran Trail, Corey Bradshaw, and Barry Brook went through 30 years of published estimates for minimum viable population size. They standardized hundreds of species and found a median around 4169 individuals. The number has a wide confidence interval, and it is not a law of physics, it is a statistical center of gravity. For many vertebrates, that scale gives a reasonable chance of persistence over roughly 40 generations. Then, add demography, disasters, and genetics. Put that next to Franklin S50. That is the whole problem. The naive answer is a classroom. The honest answer is a small town. The gap between 50 and 4,000 is not a failure of science. It is the difference between surviving one winter and surviving the long game. 50 people can make it through a hard season with luck. 4,000 carry enough variation to absorb surprises. The exact number depends on the species, the habitat, the mating system, and the luck of the draw. But the direction is clear. Small is not simple. Small is fragile. What are we actually asking for, though? 1 winter, 10 years, 1,000 years. A boat journey to a new island needs different math than a civilization that should outlive us. The minimum viable population has a time horizon baked into it. Short horizon, small number, long horizon. Bigger number, no horizon at all, and the honest answer becomes a moving target. That is why scientists argue about this. They are not bad at math. They are arguing about how much future you want to buy. Let me slow down and take you to a real island, because this is where the abstract turns into a face. In 1775, a catastrophic typhoon swept across Pingelap, a tiny atoll in the Pacific. Only about 20 people survived. That is not a metaphor and not a thought experiment. It is the documented history of a human population that had to rebuild itself from almost nothing. Here is what happened next. One of the survivors likely carried a rare recessive mutation tied to complete colorblindness. In a normal population, that mutation stays buried because 2 carriers rarely meet. On Pingelap, everyone descended from the same small circle, so the carriers met constantly. By the 4th generation, around 2.7% of the islanders had it. By the 6th generation, roughly 4.9%. Today, the condition, called mascun, affects nearly 10% of the population, and about another 30% carry the mutation without symptoms. In the United States, complete colorblindness affects about 1 person in 33,000. The same biology that let those 20 people survive gave the island a genetic archive, written mostly in one family's handwriting. I should pause and say something that sounds obvious, but rarely gets said out loud. This is not a moral judgment about the Pingelapese. It is a statistical fact about what happens when a founder pool is too small. They built a living community. They kept their language. They recovered from catastrophe under conditions most modern people cannot imagine. Their story is not a failure. It is the cleanest human demonstration that a handful of survivors is not the same as a healthy starting population. Now take the same logic and add an epidemic. Small groups do not just inherit illnesses from relatives. A single disease can also flatten them when it arrives with 1 traveler, 1 animal, or 1 bad season. What happens when disease arrives? The real case reads like a disaster movie, except it happened to black-footed ferrets in Wyoming. In 1981, researchers rediscovered a tiny wild population near the town of Meteets. It grew to around 130 animals, which sounds like a comeback. Then, canine distemper and sylvatic plague tore through it. By 1985, only about 18 ferrets remained. Here is the second twist. Researchers captured 18 animals for a rescue breeding program, but only 7 of them produced offspring that survived and had descendants. Every black-footed ferret alive today, in zoos, in breeding centers, and in the wild, traces back to those 7 founders. That is a miracle. It is also a warning. Rachel Santimeyer and her colleagues went through 20 years of breeding records and linked rising inbreeding coefficients to worse sperm quality, lower pregnancy success, and smaller litters. The rescue worked because humans managed it with pedigrees, frozen semen, veterinary care, and enormous attention. 7 founders cannot hold a population together by themselves. They can only hand the crisis to a better-equipped generation. The ferret rescue teaches one more thing. People can manage genetics. They cannot ignore it. The breeding program used every trick in the zoo book: pedigrees, frozen semen, hormone monitoring, artificial insemination, and endless record-keeping. That is not nature doing its job. That is culture doing nature's homework. A human rebuild could do the same. It could also fail the same way if the paperwork, the trust, and the shared memory collapse. Tools are only as strong as the people who keep them alive. The upper bound of the problem is less dramatic, but just as real. Too many people is also a stopping condition. Imagine trying to rebuild civilization with 5,000 people, but no agricultural surplus, no cold chain, no sewage system, and no division of labor that everyone can agree on. The food runs out before the gene pool does. The population grows past what the surrounding land can carry, and then you get famine, conflict, and a second kind of collapse. A viable human group needs genetic diversity to survive disease. It also needs social and ecological stability to keep everyone alive while that diversity does its work. A larger population also needs rules, and this is where biology and politics get tangled. 5,000 unrelated people will not automatically cooperate. They need language, trust, courts, storage, and a way to punish people who break the food stores. You cannot put that in a gene. You have to build it in a culture, slowly, from scratch. So the real minimum is not just a number of bodies. It is a number of people who can hold a common story together long enough to become a society. There is a quieter version of the food problem that rarely makes it into survival videos. You are not just rebuilding calories. You are rebuilding knowledge, and knowledge lives in brains that need years to learn it. A farmer who can read the soil, a healer who knows which plants to chew, a boat builder who can read the water, a grandmother who remembers the last drought. You cannot pull that expertise out of a book if nobody alive can read that book fluently. With a tiny crew, one death is not just a loss, it is the permanent erasure of a whole job description. With more people, the same knowledge exists in several heads, so the culture can absorb loss without falling apart. Speaking of stories, here is an uncomfortable thought. The first generation after a collapse would carry almost everything. They would remember how to make fire, how to sew, how to argue. Their grandchildren would remember half of it. Their great-grandchildren would remember less. Civilizations do not only die when food runs out. They die when too few people know what they know, and the knowledge slips away between generations. A small crew is not just a genetic bottleneck. It is a memory bottleneck. This is why the question has no single clean integer. The minimum is a negotiation between two different worlds. Genetics wants a large, diverse, slowly mixing population. Logistics wants a small, portable, manageable one. 50 is too small for genes. 500 is often too small for long-term evolution. Several thousand looks closer to a workable order of magnitude. And even that, guess, depends on leadership, food, climate, disease, isolation, and a reckless amount of luck. Before you decide that the whole project is doomed, I want to tell you about the time we actually did almost this exact thing. Around 930,000 years ago, our ancestors went through a severe bottleneck. Wang Jihu and a large international team published an analysis in Science in 2023. They used a new method called FitCol on more than 3,000 modern human genomes. Their reconstruction put the number of breeding individuals at roughly 1,280. They estimated that the bottleneck lasted about 117,000 years between roughly 930,000 and 813,000 years ago. That is not a mythological tribe. That is the estimated size of the human breeding population. The entire species for over 100,000 years. Let that number sit next to the ferret for a second. We watched 130 ferrets almost die of disease, and 18 survivors needed a rescue team. Our ancestors were once about 1,280 breeding individuals. No veterinary care, no frozen sperm, no spreadsheet, no knowledge that their descendants would one day ask this question. They did not only survive, they kept enough genetic threads unbroken that the whole fabric of modern humanity eventually unspooled from them. The fact that you are here suggests it was possible. It also suggests the margin was terrifyingly thin. One more number, and then I will stop stacking evidence. Hugh and his team estimated breeding individuals, not total population. A population of 1,280 breeders probably included more living people, because children, elders, and adolescents did not all reproduce. Still, the effective number is the number that counts for the future. The rest are passengers, beloved and necessary. But not all of them pass DNA to the next generation. That is why 1,280 feels small, because it was small. There is a famous name attached to small starting populations, and it needs a gentle correction. Y chromosomal Adam and mitochondrial Eve are not the first man and woman. They are the most recent common ancestors of all living paternal and maternal lineages. They also lived at very different times according to different estimates. A 2015 study led by Monica Carmin dated the Y chromosomal most recent common ancestor to around 254,000 years ago, with a wide confidence interval. Other studies have produced an even larger spread. The important lesson is that these ancestors were never alone. They were simply the last survivors in a race of lineages. Every other person alive around them left no living descendants, or saw their lineages disappear. Calling them the starting population is like calling the last voter of an election the entire government. So how many people would you actually put on the list? The honest answer is that nobody knows, and pretending otherwise would be a lie. But the evidence points toward a shape rather than a single digit. 100 is an emergency ward, not a founding population. Several hundred is enough for a short-term island story under careful management. A few thousand begins to look like a real minimum for a self-sustaining population over generations. If you want long-term evolutionary potential, the spread of estimates pushes toward 10,000 or more. Those are speculative ranges, not commandments. They are the best the science can do with the chaos of history. The wild card in every estimate is behavior, and this is where human beings are genuinely strange. We can steer our own genetic future by making choices that ferrets cannot make. We can marry outside our group. We can share ancestry records. We can screen embryos for lethal recessives. We can preserve frozen cells and keep a written map of who is related to whom. Those tools do not cancel the biology. They just mean that a human population has two strands of inheritance, one in the DNA and one in the culture. Both have to survive the night. Let me push that further, because the temptation is to conclude that technology solves everything. You could imagine a future colony that screens every embryo, keeps a giant sperm bank sequences, everyone's genome, and runs a perfect breeding registry. Maybe it can start with fewer people. That may be true for a laboratory population, but genetic diversity is not only about harmful recessives, it is also about immune systems that recognize different pathogens, metabolic variations that work in different climates, and alleles that mean nothing today and save lives in 100 years. You cannot screen for a threat that has not arrived yet. You can only keep enough variation around so that somebody somewhere has a chance. Here is the part that makes me like humans more than ferrets. We can choose to be interested in each other. We can keep pets, adopt strangers, write down who married whom, and care about people we will never meet. None of that changes the biology. A population that values diversity on purpose has a better chance of keeping it. A population that treats difference as a weakness will burn its own future. Same genes, very different outcomes. Which brings me back to your city and your flashlight. When you count the people in that empty street, you are not counting warm bodies. You are counting carriers of variation, immune histories, metabolic quirks, talents, grudges, recipes, memories, and exact combinations of alleles that make each person a one-time experiment. A crowd looks redundant until you realize that redundancy is the whole point. In genetics, redundancy is not waste. It is a buffer against the future. The last time humanity fell to a dangerously small number, our ancestors did not know a test was happening. There was no director. There was no director. There was no goal. There was no promise that the bottleneck would end. They just kept finding food, kept raising children, kept marrying across groups when they could, and kept the fire of variation alive through 117,000 years of bad odds. They left no parliament and no written plan. They left something better, a genome that contains the accumulated decisions of every generation that refused to end. One last image, and then I will leave you on the street where we started. Imagine those lights coming back on, window by window from the central square outward. The security guard wakes up. The taxi driver stubs out his cigarette and starts the engine. A door opens somewhere down the block, and then another. And then the whole city is humming again. The empty street was never the hard part. The hard part was the night after the lights died, when a small group had to decide that one generation of luck was not enough, and that they would rather hand the future to someone they would never meet. That is what a starting population really is. It is a promise carried in bodies, passed from hand to hand, tested by every disease and every winter and every wrong turn, still burning when the flashlight beam finally finds another pair of footprints. You are the result of that promise. Every time you meet a stranger, you are looking at another copy of it.